Hey everybody, it's Nathan Selove with another edition of Autism Actually Speaking. Today I wanted to talk about being a woman on the spectrum. But I'm not a woman on the spectrum, so I decided to bring in my favorite woman on the spectrum, my lovely wife, Jess Selove. Jess, how are you on this fine day?
It's not fine, it's gross out, it's cloudy.
It is a little bit overcast. So, we're going to talk a little bit about her experience as being a woman on the spectrum.
A typical disclaimer of ours is that if you've met one autistic, you've met one autistic. This is obviously always true, and particularly true when talking about your identity as a autistic who is also another identity, because our identities intersect. And that changes based on your background and what you do and your ethics and how you move through the world and your presentation, an endless number of things.
And socioeconomic status.
That was part of my background. But anyway, so again, this is my experience, and I know that some women on the spectrum will find commonality with this. Some men might, some non-binary folks might. If it resonates with you, cool, talk about it in the comments. If it doesn't, talk about that.
Yeah. So let's start off by talking about diagnosis then. So what about your own diagnosis story do you feel was unique to you because you're a woman?
Well, I didn't know that I was autistic until I was an adult, and I didn't achieve a diagnosis until about a year ago.
Yeah, about a year ago.
Because I had never had the opportunity to be seen by anyone who was a specialist in autism, and so that was a journey that was kind of scary for me. And I know that a lot of people who are raised as women or as girls are on the spectrum and are not diagnosed. There are a lot of reasons for that, but a lot of it has to do with your culture and society. And, you know, we talk a lot about how our society has an idea about like neurotypical as the default. Part of why is because they have ideas about what does one gender look like, you know, how do girls do things or talk about things, and how do boys, and so when you don't have the ability to automatically input this social information and reflect it, you can kind of stick out, and girls are policed from a much younger age by other people to act a certain way. You know, if you see a boy running around, jumping off things, spinning around, a lot of times people might say, that's just boys, they're energetic and chaotic and that's who they are for a little bit. And for girls, they might say, something's wrong with you, you need to tone it down.
Yeah. And there was also, you didn't have as much access to resources because of where you lived, right?
Yeah, I grew up in a rural area, and even between Nathan and myself, I'm 3 years older than him.
Yeah.
And so even that small difference really did matter, because we kind of are a generation that sort of marks a shift towards including more people in the bracket of autism spectrum disorder. I know Nathan was diagnosed with Asperger's, a term that's no longer used.
Yeah.
Now it's just under the umbrella term autism spectrum disorder.
Yeah.
But at the time, people were still learning that autistic doesn't just look one certain way. And so part of that was where I was. Part of it, again, was because I was a girl. I had to learn how to mask or else face ostracization.
Yeah.
And isolation. And so a lot of girls who don't have a diagnosis up until adulthood, it's because they had to learn how to mask it, because the ramifications for otherwise were pretty painful or undesirable.
Yeah, you get so good at masking it that people don't believe that you're actually autistic, therefore you can't get accommodations.
Which, as a side note, for those of you who aren't familiar with masking, it basically just means that you pass as someone neurotypical, or pass well enough that people think you are.
You find methods of passing. I actually made an entire video about this, which you should all go check out.
That's true. And the reason why it can be harmful to that autistic person is that it's kind of like wearing high heels all day, but amplified and internally and emotionally and mentally. So you might be able to do it for 5 minutes and not really notice a difference, or 10 minutes or an hour or 24 hours.
Or one day here and there.
We all have different limits, but eventually it's going to wear down on you, it's going to harm you, and it's going to just make your life a little bit harder. So for people who might wonder, why don't autistics just do this magical passing thing all the time? For one thing, we shouldn't have to. And for another, we can't. It's kind of like holding your breath.
So now that you have your diagnosis, how does that change the way that you experience being autistic and the way you internalize it both now and in the past?
I mean, like I said, I didn't know I was autistic until I was an adult and had already kind of formed an identity for myself. And so I did struggle with accepting that, only because to me it was something that was a huge change. And I know logically that doesn't make sense. It's not a change. It's always been who I am. But I did struggle with facing this new information and integrating it into my life. But some of it was helpful because I learned from other people in the spectrum that there are things that you can do to kind of mitigate that. I learned a lot about, even that I have self-accommodations that I don't need to feel bad about. I'd been using self-accommodations for a lot of my life, but there was often some level of guilt attached to it. So just knowing that it's okay for me to use that and it's reasonable and expected, that helped a lot with me. And looking back just on my behavior as a child, or how I experienced other people or how other people experienced me, it sort of helps to know that that was always present, and so I wasn't just this weird alien dropped in the middle of a bunch of humans who couldn't figure out how to do anything.
So you did have a little bit of hesitancy to accept the identity of autism, which kind of made you put off getting a diagnosis for a while. So what advice would you have to people that are going through a similar mindset where either they're concerned about asking for accommodation because they feel like that might be imposing on them, or they're concerned about accepting autism as part of their identity because they have lived a lot of their life not considering themselves autistic?
Well, I don't know that I would have advice per se, because I consider myself fortunate that I was able to find someone who is knowledgeable about autism in adults, autism in women who are adults. Those things are kind of a little bit more rare as you go further away from, the sort of stereotype as the autistic child. If you're an autistic who is an adult, you might find that a lot of mental health professionals are not knowledgeable enough, and that can be hard. A lot of autistics can benefit from therapy, and especially like cognitive behavioral therapy, but it is important that they find someone who knows how to work with them, and sometimes there are therapists who just don't. And some of them, it's just ignorance, and some of them, it truly is this erasure of our identity, assuming that if you have any level of function, then you must not be autistic, and that's really hard. But I would say that we've talked before about self-diagnosis. That was kind of helpful in mentally learning that. I kind of dipped my toes in that over time. I sort of privately acknowledged to myself that it was likely I was autistic, and did more research, and kind of was validated by other people in my life that actually made sense, or, oh, you didn't know. And kind of over time, after I felt comfortable with that, I was okay with talking with certain people about being autistic. And then it did kind of become public because of your play. And a lot of people were surprised, but a
lot of people weren't. Prior to that play coming out, there were a lot of people that wrote in the comments like, wait a minute. Mm-hmm. Wait a minute.
Yeah. And it's okay to wonder if people are autistic. There are people I meet all the time where I think, oh, you definitely are. But it is also worth considering sometimes asking someone, especially someone who's autistic who doesn't like lying or isn't good at it, they might be kind of surprised and thrown off balance and not know how to respond. Yeah. And they also might not be up to sharing that. It's kind of a more private thing. If it's someone that you're close with and maybe at a private time you can kind of talk to them and ask them if they've ever explored that for themselves, but be kind of sensitive to that and back off
Yeah, one of the
if they seem like they're not up to talking to you about it, and just let them know you're available if they ever do want to talk.
Yeah, one of the arguments that I've made in past videos is that we should create a world in which people feel comfortable sharing their diagnosis, but because we don't live in a world that treats diagnosis as being normalized or treats autism as being normalized, we should respect people when they do not want to disclose their own diagnosis or their own identity as an autistic.
What I would say is, if you can, try to find mental health professionals who know at least a little bit about autism spectrum. Not even necessarily for the purpose of diagnoses. I know there are some therapists who are familiar with autism spectrum, familiar with behaviors and the way that might impact someone's relationships in life, but they don't do official diagnosis. That person can still be helpful to you. Sometimes they know of better resources or people out there who can help you if you ever do seek a diagnosis so that you can achieve accommodations. But other than that, it can just be really helpful having someone who is knowledgeable. We've talked before about reaching out to groups like ASAN, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, because they are knowledgeable and they also are very much about representing autistics from the viewpoint of autistics, which is important. There are specific groups that are geared towards women. There are now books out about women on the spectrum. I don't know if anyone's ever seen The Kiss Quotient or seen that book. The Kiss Quotient is out. It's a story about an autistic woman, and it's a romance written from her perspective, or from her with her as the protagonist. And so just that little bit of representation of not just seeing a character in a book or a movie and knowing that they're autistic, but them also representing autistics by being open about that is kind of something to take joy in and try to see if that feels like it helps you to connect with things like that.
So do you have any final thoughts on your experience as being a woman on the spectrum?
Yeah, I would say that it's kind of surprising to me how many other women I meet and end up kind of disclosing that I'm autistic, and they say, oh, me too. I just don't tell people because they don't know, or they are surprised. And so if you feel comfortable talking with other people about that, especially close friends, then it can be really good to just meet other people who are on the spectrum who have similar experiences. Sometimes there are a lot of experiences that will match with like men on the spectrum, and sometimes there are not. One of the things that is kind of why women on the spectrum aren't always diagnosed early is that in our particular culture, there are certain characteristics that are associated with men or considered not really surprising in men, such as being direct, being a little bit more upfront and blunt about your feelings, and in women that can be perceived as being critical or being harsh. And so there are plenty of women on the spectrum who find it easier to communicate with men who are okay with that, because it just seems as if they are being reasonable in talking to them. And for some neurotypical women, because of how they've been raised to understand the behavior of other women, they feel that an autistic woman might be trying to hurt their feelings or challenge them. So kind of being aware of the fact that just because your particular characteristics don't fit in every social group doesn't mean that they are wrong. If you are hurting someone, it's definitely good to listen to them and try to find out ways to avoid hurting them. But if it's your behavior is treated differently from, say, a man's, or from a different generation or things like that, maybe just take into account that that's not the right place for you to let loose and be yourself, and that you might have to get that elsewhere.
So one final question real quick. On a scale of 1 to 10, how wonderful is your husband?
Potato.
So keep in mind, today's video was just a glimpse into the life of another person who isn't necessarily always represented on this channel. I mean, Jess has been in a few videos, but most of the videos are primarily focused on me. So If there are some other people that you think I should make sure to include more voices into the channel, then please leave a comment down below and discuss it. I have done other video interviews in the past, which you should definitely go check out, but give us some feedback in the comments.
And yeah, I would say that if you want, you can try to comment below and discuss different ways in which you received support from your identity for being on the spectrum. Some of us didn't get diagnosed until later in life, and that was okay, and some of us really could have used diagnosis and accommodations much earlier. But I think that most of us have something to help other autistics that they might not have thought about. So yeah, please comment below, discuss amongst yourselves what you found from your experience, and share with us. We want to hear your stories, and other people on the channel want to hear them.
Yeah. Well, that's today's video. Thank you all for watching. If you liked this episode, please give it a like, a share, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. Check out some of my other stuff. And if you want to support the channel in other ways, support me on Patreon. And in the meantime, if you have any questions or topics you'd like addressed, please leave them in the comments below or message me on my Facebook, also linked below. And remember,
if you spent most of your time as a child prior to when you first talked at 4 years old, going around the house saying doodle, 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 you might be autistic.